18, it says, confess your faults one to another and pray one for another that ye may be healed. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous availeth much. Elijah was a man subject to like passions as we are, and he prayed earnestly that it might not rain. And it rained not on the earth by the space of 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth brought forth her fruit. Familiar passage once again. I want to title this particular devotional, How a Sovereign God Works. How a Sovereign God Works. Last night, as I was teaching, I made a statement, and I want to say it again because it is a true statement, but I want to bring some clarity to it. I said in the Bible study that spiritual disciplines do not control a sovereign God, and that is true. I said prayer does not control God. I said fasting does not control or force God. Faith does not obligate God, and obedience does not corner God. Our spiritual disciplines do not control God. Said on last night, and it is true, that we cannot say, if I do this, God has to do that. And that is true. Because that would not be faith. That would be manipulation dressed in spirituality. And God cannot be manipulated. So all of these disciplines do not control God. God is sovereign. He cannot be controlled. But here is what must be said alongside of that truth. Just because spiritual disciplines do not control God does not mean that they should be minimized in any way. We're still called to and expected to function in spiritual disciplines of prayer, fasting, obedience, reading the word, all of these disciplines that God gives us. There's a reason why he gives us these disciplines. And James helps us with both of these truths when we look at it. Because James shows us who works in this process and how God works in this process. The whole process is this: God decides the end. God designs the process. God delights in participation, and God directs everything sovereignly throughout the whole process. Again, he decides the end, he designs the process, he delights in participation, and he directs everything throughout the entire process. It's not that he just decides the end and says, that's it. No, he designs even the process. He delights in participation, and he directs everything sovereignly throughout the process. Let me talk for a moment about how he decides the end. James points out in the New Testament, he refers back to an Old Testament prophet, Elijah. And he points out how Elijah was forced, or facing rather, a drought. And that drought was not a random drought. Elijah prayed earnestly that it might not rain. Now, in Elijah's day, rain and drought were tied to God's covenant purposes. And that means that God had already decided judgment and restoration. God had already made the decision. God decides the end. God already knew the season would end. He already purposed mercy beyond discipline. And Elijah didn't decide the outcome, God did. Prayer did not create God's will. God's will already existed. I hope we get this today. But by the same God that had decided the outcome, same God that decided the end, also designed the process. Elijah, while he prayed, did not just randomly decide to pray. I hope we don't ever assume that when we do these disciplines, it's just our natural self doing it. No, God decides the end, but he also designs the process. Because James says something intentional about Elijah. He says he prayed earnestly, and then he says he prayed again. Now, if prayer did not matter, then James would not have emphasized it and said that he prayed and then prayed again. God could have stopped the rain without Elijah, and he could have started the rain again without Elijah. But God chose not to bypass prayer. God designed the process. God didn't just decide the end, he designed the process. Elijah is being used of God praying because that's the process that God has designed to bring forth the end that he has already also designed. Prayer was the means by which the end would be reached. And so there are times when God has decided in his sovereignty an end for us, an end to a situation. But that does not mean that we are not included in his process. And these disciplines that we do, the prayer, the fasting, the obedience, all of those are a part of the process. And many times the reason we don't get to the end that God desires is because we don't engage in the process. So he decides the end, he designs the process, and then as you read, you'll see he delights in participation. James makes sure that we don't misunderstand Elijah. He says Elijah was a man subject to like passions as we are. What that means is this: Elijah was not divine, Elijah was not superhuman, Elijah was not manipulating God. Elijah was a man like us. God delighted in inviting Elijah, just like he delights in inviting us to be a part of his divine work. God is delighted, he's pleased, he's worshiped, he's adored, he's praised when we become involved in the process. We're not controlling God, we are cooperating with God. When we meet on these calls, when we have our prayer, when we do our fasting, our consecrations, all those kind of things, we are cooperating with the plan that God has already designed. He delights in that. Prayer does not make God work, but it shows that we are in relationship. It's us allowing, or God inviting us to be a part of his process. God is a relational God. So these spiritual disciplines that we do draws us into relationship with the sovereign God. So he decides the end, he designs the process, he delights in participation, and the whole time God directs everything. He maintains his sovereignty throughout it all. So if there are things that God has already purposed and spoken and declared, it's going to happen, but he pulls us into that relationship and says, now, this is your part in this plan. Don't think that the sovereignty of God excludes prayer or excludes disciplines. No, the disciplines are a part of the sovereignty of God. He's already incorporated prayer into his divine plan. He's already incorporated fasting into his divine plan. If my people called by my name will humble themselves and pray, seek my face, turn from the wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, forgive their sins, and heal the land. He's already incorporated our disciplines. That's why he tells us that we ought always pray and not faint, because that is a part of his divine plan. That's how he works sovereignly. So he directs it. He directs the whole thing. And we have to be a part of that process. I've already talked longer than I should have, but I wanted to make sure that we are clear and understand that none of our disciplines should ever be minimized. God expects us to do these things because it is a part of his plan. These things are the means by which God works his plan. Now, does he have to have these means? Absolutely not. God can speak and things be done. But because he's a God of grace and a God of mercy, he's called us to participate in his plan. And I'm humbled, I'm honored, I am rejoicing that God would include me in his sovereign plan, his sovereign will.